Hello and welcome to another episode of the Practical Astrology 101 series, where we take a look at astrological concepts and try to put them in application in terms of what's going on in the sky. So based on some feedback, I am planning to do some really basic astrology just to get everybody grounded in the same place and have something to refer back to. And admittedly, my intention was actually to have that to talk about the houses, the signs, and the planets before this particular video where we're talking about eclipses. But let's be honest, stuff happens. I wasn't in the greatest place health-wise and was not able to record those in advance. So I'm going to try to keep this fairly basic, but if you have questions about some of the concepts that we're bringing up, such as what are houses, what are signs, how do I find those, then stay tuned and definitely subscribe to this channel because there will be episodes coming out. I believe one a month is what I have scheduled for in the new year. So keep an eye out for that. But today I wanted to talk about eclipses because we are actually starting a new eclipse series. And I'll explain what that means in a second. But I'm going to drop this a few days before we have a lunar eclipse coming up in the sign of Taurus. And I want to prepare you for sort of understanding what that means in a bigger context of the eclipses that we'll be going through for the next roughly a little less than 2 years. So we will briefly touch on what is an eclipse and the energy of eclipses, but if you're interested in more about that, more of the kind of magical side, what you should and shouldn't do during an eclipse, there's tons of great resources on that. I'm going to more focus in this video on the astrology of an eclipse series and what eclipses might be pointing to in your own chart personally and how you can find that. So stay tuned if that sounds interesting. All right, we're going to start by just very quickly covering what is an eclipse and some of the basics of the energetics. So if you're familiar with the idea of a new moon and a full moon, an eclipse is typically a more dramatic version of that. So a new moon is the point in the cycle where we initiate and we plant a seed. It's the very beginning though. We're not doing the work yet. We're not really actually like starting the plant. We're literally dropping the seed in the ground. So, you know, we're having a new idea, a new perspective, a new way of doing things that kind of sparks with the full moon, and then we carry it out through the lunar cycle. And one thing I love about the moon and about lunar cycles is that they're very nested. So sometimes in astrology, for example, you'll hear people talk about the correlation between the moon's 28-day cycle and Saturn's approximately 28, 29-year cycle. But the moon itself also has this nested quality. So when you're looking at the monthly lunar cycle, right, we go from new moon to new moon. So an idea kind of germinates. It builds, it builds, it builds as we're waxing. And then the full moon is halfway through that cycle. So the full moon represents harvesting, things coming to fruition. If you want to know more about this energy, as well as about the kind of waning cycle, I've been doing a lot of posts about that over on my Instagram at Queer Magical. So I've got sort of like lengthy posts, some essays, some pictures, some different things, but all talking about the topic of this harvesting energy, this fruition energy, and then the clearing. So if you want to know about that, definitely check out Instagram. That happens 2 weeks in, and then 14 days, I guess, roughly. And then we start to wane. And so after the full moon, we start to clear things away that aren't serving us. We start to realize that things that aren't working or need to be adjusted or just need to be let go. It's a composting energy. It's a death card energy if you're a tarot person. And we keep, having that kind of clearing, that letting go until, again, we make it back to the new moon. So that's the moon cycle in brief. And then when it's an eclipse, it's still a new moon or a full moon. So eclipses always happen on the new moon or the full moon. Solar eclipses happen on the new moon. Lunar eclipses happen on the full moon. And I'm not going to go too much into like the math of it because that's not really what I'm doing here. But you can think of a lunar eclipse, again, lunar goes with the full moon, as a more dramatic version of a full moon, as maybe a big clearing or maybe a tower moment, maybe something that you needed to clear for a while and have been struggling with. The lunar eclipse may kind of come in and help you with that. A solar eclipse, a new moon eclipse, again, dramatic, but may help you to seed things, to see new perspectives, to start things. It's also important to keep in mind that the way the timing of the eclipse affects you is personal. So we're going to go into like finding where it is in your chart, but also depending on whether you're a very like lunar ruled person or just the way the timing of your body works. Some people experience certain eclipses more fully, just like some people experience normal moon phases more fully. So I, for example, every full moon, like I'm going to have insomnia. I'm going to be a little more emotional. New moon's also sometimes a little more emotional depending on the sign. I just know that about myself. And I know that eclipses, for me, and for some of you, it's not always on the day of the eclipse. So the eclipse has kind of I'm not sure if shadow period is actually the term that's used for this specifically, but it has kind of a period on either side. I'm going to call it a shadow period. Pardon if that's not the exact correct term. But we use that term for retrograde, so I'm going to use it here. There is a period on either side of the eclipse. So, keep in mind that you may not feel it right away. You may feel it, or you may feel it energetically right away and not know what it was about until a month later, 2 months later, right? It can take a little while to know what eclipses are about. And although I'm not going to say a lot about the energetics, I will just say that generally it's not recommended that you try super hard to work with an eclipse or make it be about something. I'll tell you from personal experience that almost never works. So I like to approach eclipses with sort of curiosity, openness, rest if I can, like not necessarily having big plans right around an eclipse and just letting that energy come through. So you may be wondering, what is the nesting piece I talked about? You know, I said that it was nested and everything. Well, an eclipse series, so we talked about how a moon has, the moon cycle is 28 days approximately. Well, also, a lot of times we look to the signs and we make it more of a 6 month, or actually a full year cycle, I should say, for something in a specific sign. So let me give you an example. We just experienced recently a new moon in Scorpio. New moon in Scorpio always occurs around this time of year. And then 6 months later, roughly, we will experience a full moon in Scorpio. And then when it comes to this time again, we'll experience a new moon. So you can kind of see how there's the month-long cycle, but there's also sort of a year-long cycle. Because, of course, everything we plant does not manifest in a month, nor does it manifest in a year necessarily, but you can sometimes see the themes, particularly if you look at that sign and then you look at the house in your chart where that shows up. And I'll show you how to do that in a second. But if you take a look at that theme, so for example, for me, the new moon was in my 5th house, which is about hobbies, play, personal pleasure, kids, has a bunch of themes. And then I know that, the new moon is going to be like a starting energy there. It also might be a kind of Scorpio feeling energy, maybe a start to some shadow work or some deep interrogation in those areas, which has totally been true for me. And then I can expect that in 6 months, there might be a feeling of like some of the stuff that the energy I'm planting right now might be really coming to fruition. I might be able to see it in my life more. And then as we move to the next new moon, it's like, what do we need to clear out from that phase? So what's interesting about that is that, of course, every month we have new and full moons. So there's 12 different cycles that are slightly staggered that you're always going through, if that makes sense. I'll actually show you. I'm going to use a chart as a teaching tool. I'm going to just warn you in advance. This is my chart, which I'm going to not, too late. This is my chart. Basically, it's a Cancer rising chart. So if you're used to seeing Aries right here, or you're used to seeing your rising sign, you can just turn it, right? So this is a Cancer rising chart. But you can see that there's these little wedges, right? So each of these wedges represents a house in my chart. And I'll explain a little about how this chart is configured in different house systems briefly later on. But for now, if you look at your chart, which you can pull up on astro.com, if you go to free horoscopes, it's under, I believe, they move things around a little bit, but you're looking for something called extended chart selection. You can put in your birth information. You will need a birth time for anything dealing with houses. So if you don't know your birth time or don't have an estimate on that, you can go to people to have your birth time rectified. I don't have a great list of astrologers. I've heard Patrick Watson mentioned a lot for rectifications, but if you're interested in this, let me know and I'll try to find you like a astrologer of color or somebody, queer astrologer or something who does this kind of thing, since I always like to promote folks who are marginalized in the space. Point is, if you don't know your birth time, and you don't have a rectified chart, you're not going to necessarily be able to identify the area of life that the eclipses fall into. But if you do, you can go pull that up and then it'll give you, little wedges like this. And so you can see based on the sign where something is happening. So I know that the new moon happened in Scorpio and it happened specifically in my 5th house. So I can look for the exact spot where it happened in my chart. And that's how I would know. And so, there's a new moon in this house, and then the next month there's a new moon in this house, and then this house. So you can see how each month you're kind of adding on. There's a cycle from last year wrapping up. There's a new cycle starting. So it's always kind of nested like this. Okay, so that's that idea. Now we come back to eclipses, and this gets even more sort of structured and easier to understand, because eclipses happen in the same 2 signs, which are opposite one another on the chart, on opposite sides of the chart. And they happen in those 2 signs for about a year and a half, give or take. It varies a little bit. And that's because of these things called the nodes. Not going to try to go into what the nodes are or like everything about the mathematical calculation of the nodes. And the nodes are a really rich and exciting subject. So I'd love to do a video on them. But for now, I'm going to stop myself and just say that there's something called the nodes. And it means that the eclipses tend to repeat or always repeat in 2 signs. There's usually a little bit of overlap at the end. So we're actually at that point right now where we are wrapping up a series and starting a new one, which is why I wanted to do this video right now. So there's a little bit of overlap, and we'll talk about that because we're right there. But generally speaking, you can think of yourself engaging with 2 themes on opposite sides of your chart throughout the period of the eclipse series. So just sit with that for a minute. So 2 themes, opposite sides. And then about a year and a half later, it'll start to move into a different series as the old one is wrapping up. So that allows you to work with those themes and to have these kind of flashpoints or eclipses in the themes. So you can see, you'll have a lunar eclipse, you'll have a solar eclipse happening throughout that period. Generally, eclipse season typically will have between, is it ever 1? I know it's between 2 and 3, maybe sometimes it's just 1, but usually 2 or 3 eclipses will happen like back to back, and then you won't have eclipses for about 6 months. So that's what's happened. This year we had one, I think back in, maybe we had a May, June, I honestly can't recall. But now we're about to go into a November eclipse and a December eclipse. And they happen to be part of 2 different series, and so that's that overlap that we'll talk about, but they still are happening together. So eclipse seasons can be kind of, and then in the period between eclipses, you can have a lot of integration, a lot of processing, realizing what that eclipse was about and actually working with the energy. So again, you might not be able to work with the energy during the eclipse. Hold tight. That will start to develop and integrate, and you'll start to figure it out. When you're working with these polarities, which is what we call the signs on opposite sides, you're not just working through the eclipses. So I would encourage you, as we're coming up on a new series, if you can, to take some time to journal and write about the themes that show up in your chart, which we'll take a look at in a second. Whatever those 2 sides are, the themes of those 2 houses that are opposite, doing some journaling can be really helpful. What are my current beliefs about this topic? What is really coming up for me or has been coming up for me about this topic? What is my kind of status quo just as the series is starting? And then it will be really interesting if through the series, maybe like right after eclipses, maybe in between 2 eclipses at like the midway point, you might continue writing about what has changed. Or if you're not a big journaler and you just want to hold on to that and then write about it a year and a half later and see how things have changed. Because it's often hard to know exactly in the moment what's happening. I find journaling to be a really good way to integrate. So some prompt questions might be, what are my current beliefs about theme? How is theme showing up in my life? How would I describe or define some of the keywords for that theme right now? stuff like that, and then ask the same questions a year and a half later or at points in between. So that's one way you can work with it. Now let's take a look at the specific series that we're leaving and coming into. So the way it works, again, this is my chart, so pardon that it's Cancer rising. But since it's a Cancer rising chart, Gemini is right here, Taurus is right here. Across the chart, we have Sagittarius opposite Gemini, Scorpio opposite Taurus. So again, we're not going to talk about the nodes, but I'll just point out that the North Node has been in Gemini, moving through Gemini. Oddly, nodes move backwards. So if you have any background in astrology or have looked at charts, you may realize that most things move counterclockwise. The nodes move the other way. So that can be really confusing that we go from Gemini to Taurus if you're just starting, because you think, no, it goes Taurus, Gemini. This is the exception. So the nodes have been in Gemini and Sagittarius. And now that the North Node is moving into Gemini, that also means that the South Node is moving into Scorpio. So you can take a look at your chart and you can see, again, astro.com, pull up your free chart and you can see what house number, what little wedge is lining up with that sign. If you have questions about house systems, there is a place where you can pick the house system. We'll cover that at the very end, because I had so many questions about that in my first 6 months to a year of studying nodes and eclipses, and I couldn't figure it out. So I'm going to tell you, the answer is kind of that there is no answer, but we'll get to that at the end. So if you're curious, this is a Placidus chart. So I have little tick marks to indicate where the signs cut off, but the wedges on this chart are my houses. A little confusing. Sorry, I will get a teaching tool at some point. That's just a blank chart I can put up here. But for now, we're going to use mine that I pulled off my fridge. By the way, recommend, you can get magnetic whiteboard, and you can purchase on Etsy I'll try to link it, little magnet glyphs of the planets. So as a personal practice, this isn't 100% up to date, but as a personal practice, I will actually go to my fridge and move the glyphs as the planets move. And I find that using my hands and actually doing that gives me a little more awareness, particularly as somebody who lives in a really cloudy place and can't always look at the sky. This is an alternative way that I physically connect, even in this very symbolic way, with what the planets are doing. So as the nodes move, the eclipses start to happen on a different pair of signs. So we've been going through Gemini and Sagittarius, and if you check out resources on the eclipses, they're often going to talk about the signs, because that's universal to everyone. So we can talk about the nature of Gemini and the nature of Sagittarius and how that's happening. But I find that the richest part of looking at eclipses for personal reasons, as opposed to collective societal, government, politics, country reasons, that's called mundane astrology. That you can look at the signs a lot. I find that looking at my own personal chart, I'm much more interested in the houses, because the houses teach us, and again, we'll have a 101 on this coming up. The houses teach us the area of life we're experiencing it. So it narrows it down to what we're actually looking for. So this is going to be personal to you. So when you pull up your chart, for example, if you were Cancer rising like me, you might pull up your chart and see, okay, Gemini is my 12th, Sagittarius is my 6th. So I'm looking at, over the past year and a half, I've been looking at themes around 6th and 12th house. I'm not going to go into them again because I'm going to be doing a very extensive description, but if you just Google 3rd house, 4th house, you'll be able to find a list of topics quite easily. So I'm just going to ask you to look that up for now on your own, and then we'll have a video to link to in the future. If it's the future, check out the card up there for the video. But let's take a look more closely at Taurus and Scorpio, because that's what we're moving into. So we're moving into Taurus and Scorpio. And again, the themes of Taurus and Scorpio, I actually have my nodes on my chart, like my birth chart. My North Node, if I look that up, is in Taurus. So I'm actually experiencing what's called a nodal return. And I may talk about that in the nodes video. I'm not going to talk about it now, but it's handy for me because I know a lot about having North Node Taurus, South Node Scorpio. So, themes that might come up in general around Taurus and Scorpio. Taurus includes things like, what is pleasure for you? What is stability for you? What is feeling comfortable? what is quality, what is embodied pleasure. Big theme that I'm particularly interested in around anti-racism and how white folks have stolen everybody else's version of pleasure, and we really haven't learned, a lot of us, how to be in embodied pleasure. So that's a big theme for me for the next year and a half, and I'm going to be doing a lot of work around that publicly, and there'll be opportunities if you are white and you're interested in working with this theme and working on anti-racism in a spiritual lens. Please subscribe, follow everywhere, stay tuned. I'm pretty much at Queer Magical on all the other social platforms. But that's sort of what we're talking about with Taurus. Taurus is also Earth, so it's sustainability, it's groundedness. And then on the other side of the chart, Scorpio. Scorpio is a water sign. Scorpio is the depth. Scorpio includes going really deep, going into the emotions that might scare us, going into our shadow, investigating. It also can include things like lack and scarcity. I don't like to say Scorpio is scarcity and Taurus is abundance, because that's reductive, but like a little, like there's some of that there. That will actually bring me to my next point, which is that when you look at the signs across, do not think that they're opposites. Eclipses are all about integrating the polarity. So integrating Taurian and Scorpionic, it doesn't mean that you get rid of Scorpio because the North Node is in Taurus. It means that you integrate the two. We'll talk a lot more about that in the nodes video, but for now, I'll just leave you with that. Now, when you pull up your chart, you're going to see what houses it's in. And again, I'm not going to go over every house, but just as an example, I can see that we're coming up on Taurus, which is in my 11th, and Scorpio in my 5th. So I'm going to be looking at those themes and how to integrate themes of the 11th house, like your bigger hopes and dreams, your visions, community, organizing, friendship groups, how to integrate that with the themes I talked about earlier of more personal pleasure and hobbies. So you can see how like those things, play, pleasure, like they come in both sides, but one's a little more individual, one's a little more group. So it's about integration. So whatever two themes show up, or clusters of themes show up across the chart for you, think about the integration of them being a big part of the story. Because when you hit a specific eclipse, it's on one side, but then you're going to get one on the other. So it's always a push-pull. It's always going back and forth. That's the energy of the opposition. That's the energy of the signs across the chart. It's not about picking a winner. It's about integrating the two. So take a look, pull up your chart, and maybe you could even, in your journal, in addition to asking questions just about the themes, you might ask questions about, do these feel like opposites to me? How do these two interact in my life? Do I prioritize one over the other? Those are questions that your answers to may change as we go through it. So let's take a look at the specific eclipses that are coming up briefly, just to point out this overlap thing and to get you prepared. So November 19th coming up, should be a few days after I post this, is when we have the first eclipse of this series. And that is happening in Taurus. I believe it's at 27 degrees, but double check that. Google it. It might be 29. I'll leave a correction down below if I got it wrong. I think it's 27. But you want to look for that exact spot in your chart. So 27 Taurus is going to be like here-ish. It's going to be towards the end of the sign going counterclockwise. So you want to look at that spot. Depending on the house system you're using, it may jump the line. And I'm going to talk about that again at the very end. But find it, figure out what house it's in. And then coming up December 4th, we have 12 degrees Sagittarius is going to be the last eclipse in the series we've been going through. So I told you they overlapped. This is the overlap. So it's a little weird that we have the start and then we have the end of the other. But I actually love that. I love the way it's like a conscious kind of transition period. So anything that hasn't really been fully, processed, gone through, whatever, of the previous series, it's one more shot. And that's going to be a solar eclipse. And that is taking place, again, at 12 Sagittarius. So right in the middle of Sagittarius. Again, your chart will be rotated. So just find the Sagittarius symbol, which is a little arrow with a cross through it. And if you're looking for Taurus, it looks like a circle with like little bull horns. So look for those. You can also find on astro.com, it'll write it out in text for you as well, each sign and where it falls in your chart. So when we're when we move into December, again, it's kind of a wrap up. It's kind of interesting because it is a solar eclipse, which means it's a new moon. But there might be one last thing to start in this area of your life. One last thing. In fact, I kind of like that because I think it's, you know, you have to like let go of things sometimes to start something new. So it makes sense to me to like start one last thing once we've gone through all that work of that axis. The other thing I want to point out as we're moving into Taurus and Scorpio and we're going back and forth along this axis is that this is not the only thing that happens in these signs. So right now, again, this is a little out of date, but right now I have some of my magnets clustered around Scorpio because, like I mentioned, we had the new moon in Scorpio, the sun is, which means the sun has been in Scorpio, Mars in Scorpio. So planets are like clustering up, right? That might give you a little clue as to what the Scorpio part might be about. So if you've noticed things coming up for you with the new moon in Scorpio, especially with that energy of something new, with planets in Scorpio, in this Scorpio season, late October through first few weeks of November, think about what's been coming up for you, and that might give you a clue, especially in the theme of the house, what has been coming up for you. Again, you can't predict an eclipse, but it can give you sort of a sense. When things are moving into Taurus, or you could even look back, although I think with a starting series, I might look back to Taurus season this year, but especially Taurus season next year, I'd really see what's coming up for me there and to get a sense of the Taurus. And then if we look at both, we can get a sense of the interplay there. So keep in mind that when planets pass through signs, you can also look at some of the outer planets. If an outer planet has been in a sign, for example, Uranus has been in Taurus, Uranus energy is kind of pretty specific, but like that might give some idea to you. Some of the outer planets like Neptune, Pluto, Uranus, they're in a sign very long, but it might be a little easier when we have like a period of Jupiter or Saturn in a sign. So if you look back to when Jupiter was in Scorpio, you could even look back to when Saturn was in Scorpio. Again, we're getting like more and more years out, but sometimes you have a series where it matches up really well to Jupiter or Saturn going through a sign, and when that happens, you can often use that as a kind of clue to the kinds of things you might be working with. But again, don't try to predict too hard. Just be aware, I find that these things, that predictive astrology, no offense to predictive astrologers, but that's not really my specialty. With predictive astrology, I can get really anxious or try to control things, and I have to remind myself that the planets and the moon and the nodes, they are all reflectors, they are all energy, but they are not, you're not meant to control the future, you're not necessarily meant to predict the future perfectly. And so even if you do predictive techniques, most people who do predictive techniques aren't saying this will happen. They're looking at possibilities. And so philosophically, my recommendation is to be open and curious and just particularly observant to what's happening in those areas of your life, because that may help you to notice things the eclipse stirs up. Eclipse is like a storm in a sea, it's stirring everything up. So I would just mention that. Okay, so one last topic. I did promise that I would hit house systems. So I want to do that because this was something that confused the heck out of me, and I asked so many people and nobody really had an answer. So if you listen to popular astrologers, Chani Nicholas is an example. I'm blanking on other specifics, but if you listen to people talking about eclipse series, they talk about this back and forth between houses and how there's a particular theme for houses. Now, I remember thinking, well, shoot, I use Placidus. So Placidus is a house system, and we'll talk about house systems more in the houses video, but Placidus is an example of a house system where the houses and the signs are not ending or starting at the same spot. They're a little off. So when I take a look at, I think I said 27 Taurus maybe. Again, I'm going to put it below. I forgot the degree. But it's towards the end of Taurus, which means if it's towards the beginning or the end, it may actually jump into a different house for you. So if I look at mine, 27 does hit inside the house that most of my Taurus is in, but let's say there was an eclipse when we had the Gemini eclipses, I had this challenge that anything that happened early, wait, do I have this right? Yes. So anything that happened in Gemini, for the most part, was going to fall into my 12th house, but the first few degrees of Gemini are actually in my 11th. So I had this curiosity about, well, does that eclipse belong to this series or the next series? And what I learned is nobody has one specific answer. I think people are just like, feel it out, what works, right? So if you prefer using a house system like Placidus or Porphyry, I think does this, I believe Koch does, like a lot of the systems don't have houses and signs line up. If you prefer one of those systems and you're like me a little adamant about it, that's okay. You're just gonna have to feel into it. Does it feel more like this sign or this house or the previous house? Does it feel like this eclipse is part of a different series than it would be for most people? The good news is because it's based on the nodes moving, it's always going to be part of either this series, the last series, or the next series. It's not going to like go across the chart or anything. So you can kind of feel into, sometimes it's both. I definitely have had the advice of like, it may just be both. So think about the house that it falls in your chart system, but also think about where it would fall in whole sign houses. So whole sign houses would be where the houses line up exactly with the signs. So there's no confusion. If it happens in Taurus, it's in my 11th house in whole sign. So I might actually look at both, and sometimes they may mix in and match. But don't worry if you do use a different house system. Look it up in whole sign, look at it in your house system, figure out what feels best energetically. Again, remember that ultimately astrology is, especially lunar astrology like eclipses and nodes, is intimately tied to our own energetic experience and our physical bodies and our experiences of our bodies and our cycles and our energies. And so I'll just come back to that idea of nested cycles that I brought up earlier on, of the sort of monthly cycle, the 6-month cycle, and now we have the bigger picture of the 1.5-year cycle of these pairings. And you can see how these interact with each other. And you can see how like other transits in that sign might give you clues, but also might interact with the energy. So when you look at a specific eclipse, it may be helpful to pull up today's chart, which you can find in a lot of sites, Cafe Astrology, I think astro.com. Just look up like current chart, today's chart, astrology, and you can see exactly when the eclipse is happening, how it interacts with your chart. And this is a little more advanced. You may want to work with an astrologer on this, but if you are, love to dig in like I do, love to learn more, then that's kind of a next step you could take, is to look as the eclipse is happening. Are there particular ways in which it interacts with your personal chart? So I might have an example. So I said 29 Taurus. Yeah, so the Taurus eclipse is actually happening very close to my Chiron, and almost conjunct my Chiron across the sign border. And so Chiron is a planet of like the wounded healer. So I know that this eclipse could bring up things for me, either around my wounds or the way I'm doing healing work. May come up, not just on the day of the eclipse, but through the next 6 months or so. And so if you're curious about the energetics of this eclipse, I think especially, I don't necessarily look it up to predict it, but sometimes I look back. So if I'm feeling super emotional, I might be like, gosh, did that eclipse, I mean, all eclipses could be emotional, but like, did that eclipse like really touch maybe my moon or other planets in my chart that might be creating this experience? So that's a more advanced technique if you're looking for one. I highly encourage you to subscribe to this channel if you're interested in tarot and astrology, but also just the application of intuitive and energetic practices for marginalized people and others who are prioritizing justice and liberation. That's all what I'm about on this channel. I'd love to see you here. And we're going to continue to do this Practical Astrology 101 series with a new video each month. Starting in 2022, we're going to go back to basics, take a look at houses, planets, signs from a few different angles. We'll also get into the nodes, and if you have a particular topic you're interested in, do not forget to leave me a comment below. If you want even more richer how-to kind of content, you're always welcome to join my Patreon at patreon.com/queermagical. I will see you there, I hope.